think it's first of all important to remember that the chronological age is the age that we usually think of, how many years old we are, whether we're 40, 50, 60, or 70. And that's pretty set by the time since we were born. On the other hand, biological age really refers to the aging and the mechanisms of aging in our cells and how they change over time. And biological aging can occur at a different rate than chronological aging, depending on a person's genetic makeup, depending on their epigenetic influences, these other non-genetic influences, and also be dependent on sort of their lifestyle and how they do or do not accumulate various biological deficits as they age, or develop various syndromes or chronic diseases or illnesses as they age. Well, I think it's important to understand that we are learning more and more about the cellular processes that regulate how cells change over time and how they express a very specific aging phenotype. And what's becoming apparent is many of the chronic diseases that we see occur with advancing age, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, kidney disease, all contain similar biological influences. So by understanding the cellular aging process, we may be able to understand more universally how all these chronic diseases tend to occur with advancing age in people. I think the age that people should be concerned about these things, age-associated cellular decline, for example, is always usually before they realize that they're getting into trouble or they're experiencing some changes in their health or their functioning. Unfortunately, too often in early life and in middle age, we tend to ignore these things until they manifest themselves as, true deficits, either in terms of some development of chronic disease or illness, or some decline in our function or our ability to live and work independently. So I guess the message is we should think about these things earlier in life before they become a problem, so that we might think about what are the effective lifestyle and other interventions that could prevent the early development of these age-associated changes. I think the important thing about mitochondria and mitochondrial health, although the mitochondria have multiple functions in multiple cells, I think as people, we might notice first, because mitochondria are so important for proper muscle functioning, that if we see declines or deterioration of our mitochondrial function, some of the first things we might experience are difficulties with our ability to perform activities of daily living, our difficulties with walking or climbing stairs or getting up out of a chair, because mitochondrial function is so intrinsically related to providing energy for working skeletal muscles. We may notice those first. But that's not to say that good mitochondrial function may be really, really important for other tissues, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, the liver. We really need to think about those as well. But I think some of the early signs we might see really are in the skeletal muscle. Well, if we think about the muscle and mitochondrial health, I think that there's clearly a relationship between the well-described declines in physical functioning that occur with aging and declines in mitochondrial content and capacity or functioning in the voluntary skeletal muscles. So that one of the mechanisms by which we see declines in muscle performance with advancing age is the age-related declines in mitochondrial function. Well, when we talk about mitochondrial function, I think that the types of physical functioning that are really important are things that are related more to a person's and the muscle's endurance capacity. So if we look at tests of walking ability, how fast a person can walk a quarter of a mile, or a very simple test that we do in the laboratory all the time is something called the 6-minute walk test, where we measure the distance that someone can walk as fast as they can in 6 minutes. And that's a very reproducible, highly valid test of physical functioning that's used in a lot of research studies and has real meaning in terms of what a person's ability is to perform tasks of daily living within their own environment. With aging, there are a lot of metabolic changes, and metabolism is really this process by which cells convert food sources into energy. We see declines in some of the metabolic pathways that are necessary to break down the macronutrients to generate the energy that all of our cells need. Also, within those pathways, there are some changes in the housekeeping or the efficiency in which those pathways work. So not only do they break down these larger molecules to generate energy, but they end up producing more sort of toxic byproducts. One of the good examples of that is as mitochondria age, they become less efficient. And so while yes, they do break down macronutrients to generate energy, as they become less efficient, they also generate a lot of toxic superoxide molecules, which are toxic to cells. And in the normal state, we do a very good job of cleaning those up and sort of keeping them at bay. But as cells age, we are less able to sort of handle those sort of toxic molecules that are generated. So with aging, there's some inefficiencies that take place in mitochondrial respiration, and our cells' ability to clean up those toxic byproducts really is impaired. The other thing that happens is that with aging and with excess fat accumulation in the body, our tissues become less able to take up glucose because we get less sensitive to the hormone insulin. This is a phenomenon known as insulin resistance. So with aging, there's more fat accumulation, there's more insulin resistance, and our cells, primarily our muscle cells, are less able to take up glucose that we ingest when we're eating our meals. And so this is why the risk of type 2 diabetes increases with age. It also increases with excess adiposity or excess body fat levels, and really can cause a host of other bad outcomes. So while we're still really learning a lot about how some specific micronutrients in the diet may affect cellular energy metabolism, there are some very exciting sort of early findings suggesting that there are dietary ingredients and components of the diet that might enhance or stabilize some of these metabolic pathways that are related to energy metabolism. And by doing that, they could, one, make those pathways more efficient, so the transfer of energy from macronutrients to cellular energy is more efficient and is done in a better way. And they also may act by increasing the capacity of some of the systems in cells to transfer this energy and make usable energy in the cell. You know, there are several ingredients that are found in foods and plants and vegetables that may have these properties. We still don't understand exactly how much of these compounds we need to ingest to result in these effects, but we're learning a lot about them, and they do hold some promise, I think, for a more healthy sort of dietary approach to aging. So we know very well that skeletal muscle declines with aging, strength declines with aging. We call this sarcopenia. We know very well that there are many types of exercise and physical activity interventions that can either attenuate the loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength with aging, or further result in actually increase muscle strength and mass with aging. Particularly resistance training and high intensity power training exercise are probably the most efficacious. But there is some evidence, and we're continuing to gain more evidence, that there are specific components of the diet that might synergize with exercise to actually result in either greater increases in muscle size or mass and or greater increases in muscle strength or power. Some of the things that we've been interested in and been investigating are the interactions between exercise and dietary protein intake and specific amino acids like the branched chain amino acids that appear to be the most promyogenic of the amino acids: leucine, isoleucine, and valine. There are also other potential cellular ingredients that may synergize with exercise to result in, other specific dietary ingredients that might synergize with exercise to either cause additive benefits or synergistic benefits in terms of increasing mass or increasing strength. Sure. So the lifestyle effects, I mean, it's very clear that physical activity and exercise training can induce mitochondrial biogenesis in young individuals, and there's quite a bit of evidence in older individuals that particularly endurance training, walking, swimming, cycling can induce mitochondrial biogenesis. That's a very robust, very reproducible phenomena. It's been known for a long time, particularly in younger people. The evidence for nutritional factors influencing mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial functioning is emerging, I would say. I mean, I think there's some evidence that dietary interventions like caloric restriction may have effects on expression of mitochondrial genes and other factors related to mitochondrial respiration. There is evidence that some of the niacin metabolites, the B vitamin metabolites like nicotinamide riboside and other niacin-derived compounds, at least in preclinical studies, seem to upregulate the sirtuin molecules and induce mitochondrial biogenesis. I think those data need to be replicated in human clinical trials, and I think they will be, or at least those studies will be conducted. I think there is evidence that the allegiant tannins, things like urolithin A, again in preclinical models, seem to have positive effects on mitophagy, mitochondrial function, and endurance exercise capacity in preclinical studies, and they look promising. And there is some emerging data suggesting that they upregulate genes related to mitochondrial biogenesis in humans, and there is some data now on functional outcomes in older adults in terms of improving strength and other measures of muscle performance. So I think those are very promising. I think we still need to learn a little bit more about those compounds, and I think those molecules and other molecules and compounds. And I also think we also have to understand, again, back to the question earlier, how they might be additive or might synergize with other lifestyle factors such as physical activity and exercise. Well, when's the best time to intervene on age-related deficits? Great question. The answer is probably it's never too early to think about these things. Many of us don't have the luxury of that because when we didn't learn about the benefits of many of these things till we reached middle or older age. So we also have to deal with people who are middle-aged or older now that are asking questions about what can they do to improve their health or their risk for chronic disease or for losing their independence, for example, or frailty. And by and large, in the studies that we have done, we've shown that even in very old people, the benefits, at least of physical activity, still are pretty potent and strong, and suggest to us that at any age, starting a program of physical activity is beneficial. For nutrition, I think the same is generally true, although for both things, I think starting earlier in life is always better than waiting to start late. I think it's when we think about the losses of strength and function that occur with aging, those accumulate over 10, 30, 40 years. To think about what can be regained with whatever lifestyle intervention you choose, whether it's diet, physical activity, in 6 or 12 months, which is usually how long we study these things in clinical studies. The gains are usually small, significant, but they can't correct 30 or 40 years of decline. We can push things back a little bit. But I think what's important is if you start earlier, you haven't declined as much, and you can prevent further decline, which is also really important here. Yeah, I think the issue of how to personalize these strategies, whether they're dietary approaches or physical activity approaches, really is transformative in a way that, while we know the way we have done clinical research since we started doing these kinds of studies has been to look at sort of the mean effects of interventions. How does the average response change over time? But we've always known, when we look at our data and our results, that individuals vary in their response. Some people respond very robustly to a dietary supplement or physical activity intervention. Some people don't change very much, and in fact, some people decline. Now, some of that's related to adherence and compliance with whatever product or whatever ingredient or whatever intervention we give them, but some of it is related to their individual biological response. And I think what's sort of rising to the surface now in nutrition and physical activity is acknowledging that there are individual differences in response to interventions, and then trying to say, okay, if we have these responses, what underlying biological processes or mechanisms are influencing these responses? Let's figure that out. That's very complicated, but let's figure that out. And then maybe we can understand, by figuring that out, how to use that information to decide what the best lifestyle, dietary, physical activity strategy is right for an individual person. But I think we have to first figure out what influences that variability in response. why are some people responders and non-responders? And my guess is it's going to be a lot of the things that we've tried to understand about aging and other things. You know, there's some genetic components and influences. There's some epigenetic influences. There's some lifelong environmental influences. And there's probably some interaction with other nutrients, other lifestyle factors, and how they interact. Now that's very complicated, and it does sound very complicated, but I think one of the benefits of where we are in scientific biotechnology research and biomolecular research now is that we have a lot of tools that allow us to work with a lot of very complex data sets and that are integrated. So we have a lot of informatic capacity to understand how these biological processes really are influenced by multiple different inputs. And I don't think I think that technology is relatively new. We haven't had that kind of capacity to understand things in that way before. So I think there's a lot of promise with personalized nutrition, personalized exercise, but we have to figure that out now. That's really what's going to be important. Right, so the technology is being used in other areas to great advantage, you know, in sort of GWAS and genetics and sort of how genetic influences specific phenotypes. You know, there's a lot of work on personalized nutrition and precision nutrition, but I mean, the NIH, for example, is convening a large working group in this topic, and I think they are seeking to invest in that area because they know that there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of unmet sort of things that need to be studied further. So I think you're going to see that in the next 5 or 6, 10 years, that there's a big emphasis on precision nutrition. Yeah, so that's a really interesting but difficult question. You know, we think of epigenetic factors as being those factors that are not related to the specific genetic code or the DNA that all of our cells have. So these are these extra or on top of the genetic code. But they have a very strong biological basis. And in fact, some epigenetic alterations are really those things that happen early during life, right after conception, so that there's some epigenetic effects related to the sort of methylation of the DNA, which is a very common sort of epigenetic signature. It also appears that there are epigenetic influences that occur throughout life that are related to environmental and lifestyle factors. And what's really interesting now is that people are trying to investigate the methylation patterns in the DNA of cells and relate that to both chronological and biological aging. And it may be that this pattern of methylation or epigenetic influences in cells may be a very strong measure of biological aging. Now, why do I say maybe? Well, because there are multiple methylation sites in DNA, and which ones and how they interact is very complex, and it's only with really appropriate science and bioinformatics technology that we're only now being able to understand and unravel which epigenetic sites and methylation sites are really the ones that are the most important for biological aging. And if you look in the literature now, there are a number of different sort of markers of biological aging that rely on different DNA methylation sites in cells and a pattern, different patterns of these. So this is a very exploding area. I think it has a lot of promise. I think there's limited evidence right now about whether, once you know what your methylation pattern is in your cells, are there interventions, are there lifestyle interventions that might be able to alter that in a favorable way, that DNA methylation pattern or that measured marker of biological aging? There is some data to suggest that some extreme dietary interventions might hold promise for doing this, like dietary restriction or caloric restriction. But I think that's those findings are very preliminary, and I think they would need to be validated in much larger samples. But I think it's a very interesting area, and it has a lot of promise in terms of us trying to have really good tools to predict aging, and also tools to understand how many different types of interventions might influence this process, whether they're dietary or physical activity, environmental things, and other lifestyle behaviors.